Okay, Paul Rafflick says, I'd like you to speculate. I can do that. If the founding fathers, most notably George Washington, didn't want our country to be run, I guess, by monarchs or monarch types, why didn't they put term limits in the Constitution for the executive and legislative branches? In other words, why did it take until 1951 for an amendment to be put in our Constitution to limit the president to 2 terms in office? I can understand why people would want term limits in Congress, considering the fact that the more they get reelected, the less and less they represent their own peoples or the Constitution, and the more and more they represent themselves. Notable examples: Nancy Pelosi, John McCain, Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Sheila Jackson Lee, Maxine Waters, Lisa Murkowski, etc. When you look at the founders and the structure of the Constitution I think is perfect. They had such a clean understanding of human nature. Apparently, T.G. Gecko says that Hamilton actually did do that. But they could only protect themselves and protect us against the dangers that they could imagine. Clearly, they couldn't protect themselves or us or the country or the structure. They couldn't write into the Constitution things that they could not imagine. And there's a lot of things I think that happen today that they simply couldn't imagine. And I'm not talking about things like the internet or anything like that. I think the thing that is the most concerning to me of all of this is when I think about if these people were alive today, George Washington example, or Adams or Hamilton or anything. And I think if they saw what we put up with, if they saw how much we tolerate, they would be ashamed of us. And that makes me ashamed of us. They were, by and large, well-established, wealthy people, certainly in the case of Washington and Jefferson, although Washington's finances, and I suspect Jefferson's as well, were not terrific. These people owned estates. Anybody who's seen Monticello, that's not a poor man's house. So when you have a revolution and you're prepared to hang for it, and you've got something to lose, that's never happened before or since. So it must have been a pretty strong motivation, because these guys were not Les Miserables gutter snipes. These people were living pretty well. And it was a philosophical objection, and it was one they took very seriously. And so I don't think they could have imagined communism. I know it seems kind of hard to believe, but I just don't think they could have imagined it. They imagined monarchies, they imagined tyrannies. They knew what they looked like. But the idea that people would become so soft, and that it would take so long to just slowly lose the moral core, I think they must have simply not imagined it. Because when you hear what they say about these kind of things, their response is always pretty straightforward. Their response is, well, you don't need term limitations, because the people, if the representative's doing a bad job and not representing them, the people simply sweep them out of office. They will simply remove them. They said basically that the best reason that they didn't have to put in all of these little, restrictions into the Constitution, which would have destroyed the Constitution. Here's the things that you can't do. They said because every American will read the Constitution, understand the Constitution, and when they see things that are unconstitutional, they will essentially rise up in their righteous anger and throw the clowns out of office in the next election, if not sooner. And that's what they really thought would happen. And I think that basically was more or less the case for 2/3 or 3/4 of the length of this country. But those people are gone now. And when I think about what I tolerate, when I think about, $10 or $20 billion disappearing as a rounding error, they don't know where they misplaced it, but there's $10 billion, $10,000 million has gone someplace. And when I think about $20 trillion in debt, and when I think about all of this stacked up, and the fact that they take half of what I make when it's all said and done, about half, all across the board, I asked myself, why do we put up with this? And I realized it's because we're so prosperous. And part of that may be the borrowing. But we're so prosperous that even half of what we make, even for most of us, half or a quarter or whatever, doesn't impact us in the way that it doesn't appear to impact us the way that it should. If they launched this revolution because was it a 1 cent tax on tea? They found out that the government was taking 35, 40%, 50% of everything you make, the federal government and the state. They simply they wouldn't believe you. They would say, well, why didn't you riot? Why didn't you vote them out of office? Twain talks about a visit, I want to say it was to Italy in The Innocents Abroad, which is 1866, I think. And he was talking about seeing a tax rate in Italy. And he said that if the tax rate ever got to 7% in the United States, the people would simply burn the Congress down. Well, 7% is a good long distance behind us. So they couldn't imagine it. I really do believe that they simply couldn't imagine it. They knew how to prevent tyranny and from people taking power, but they didn't really understand the power of it, although some people did. Certainly de Tocqueville did. He said shortly after the American Revolution, after the government was set up, he said, it's a magnificent thing, this American Republic, and it's genuinely astonishingly beautiful thing to see, but men are alive now who will live to see the end of it, because once they realize that they can vote themselves money out of the treasury, then essentially it's all over. And that's exactly what's happened. We finally had a political party that is determined to cling to power and have power, even if it costs the country. They'd rather rule over the ruins. So they vote themselves money out of the treasury to buy votes. I don't know what it comes out to. I did an episode on this once called The Vote Pump, but it's in excess of $1 trillion a year, $1,000 billion every year. Goes from people like us to people that are in many cases, Social Security they paid in and so on, but the politicians stole the Social Security money. But basically, it's about $1 trillion and a half dollars goes into wealth redistribution every single year. And that's a hunk of change, that adds up. Trillion here, trillion there. So they'd just be mystified and appalled, and they would be deeply shocked and saddened that we let this happen. They'd be amazed by what they saw, and they would agree that superficially we don't appear to be restricted or tyrannized in any way that they would recognize. They wouldn't see the king's policeman down on the street or anything, not yet anyway. But the idea that all of this that we would consider ourselves to be free people when we basically have half of this stuff taken away from us without our permission, well, certainly not without our consent anyway. They take it with our permission because we don't want to go to jail. I think that would have shocked them. I really do. I think it would have really appalled them. And I don't like being ashamed of myself. I really don't. I don't know how you'd face them. I don't know what you'd say. I really don't. But that's who we are. So just Eric Blake says, dare I ask, why couldn't they imagine it? They couldn't imagine the idea that property that people would attempt to make everything communally owned. They'd never seen that before. Certainly the democracy they created didn't for a moment contemplate the idea that the government or the people will take everything there is and divide it up equally and distribute it to everything. It just never had happened before. Simply was inconceivable. What was conceivable was we'll work like slaves for the king. That's conceivable. He'll take all of our land. That's conceivable. He'll tax us into the poorhouse. That's conceivable. But the idea that the people themselves would steal from themselves is, I just don't think they could have imagined. I think it was beyond them. I don't know. I almost said that I don't know that there's a human being on earth who's caused more death and destruction than Karl Marx. And I think that without question, that's true. The question is, if it hadn't been Marx, would it have been someone else? Or was this just one of those cases where the timeline went wrong and somebody stepped on the butterfly, and we're living in this hellish, you know, alternate reality where the real world is beautiful and clean and happy and populated by all these wonderful people, and we're living in this world where Marx was born and you know, and 100 million people killed. By the way, it's another thing I was talking with Natasha about, talking about the quality of the people. I just can't stop reading about gulags now. It's all I get obsessed. I read Gulag Archipelago, I read Kolyma Tales, and now I'm reading a book called Gulag, which is a much more kind of a academic analysis of them, rather than a here's what it was like to live in them. But without question, this is the understatement of the history of the Stratosphere Lounge, but the people that went to the camps in the Soviet Union were by far the best people they had, by far. These were musicians, scientists, writers, poets. They were teachers. Anybody with any kind of an education or initiative almost certainly was going to end up there and had a very good chance of either being worked to death or shot, so one or the other. But poor Natasha was so sad thinking about what her country would be like if that hadn't happened. What would it be like if they hadn't taken all of the intelligent, sensitive, talented, kind people and put them behind barbed wire and worked them to death, and starved them to death until they worked them until they die, which took about 2 or 3 months in the Kolyma gold mines, by the way. That's about the length of time it took to take a very strong and healthy peasant boy, 17, 18-year-old boy from out in the country in Siberia, strong as an ox, healthy as it can be. You put him in the Kolyma gold mines, working 12, 16 hours a day, and his life expectancy was 2 or 3 months. That's how long it took to kill a healthy guy. I don't know what you say about that. I really don't. Let's see.